What would you do if the world cast you out with nothing but the clothes on your back and a sorrow too heavy to carry? If, at 20 years old, you found yourself utterly alone, with every door that ever meant home slammed shut behind you, for Emmeline Hale, in the raw, wind-swept expanse of the Texas Panhandle in 1884, this wasn't a question. It was the dust in her throat and the ache in her bones. Thrown out by her own kin after her sister's passing, she was left with a handful of coins and a grief that had no place to rest. And so, in a moment of quiet desperation, she bought a forgotten county jailhouse for the grand price of $1. The town laughed. They called it Hale's Folly, a tombstone for a girl who had already lost everything. But the truth waiting inside those silent, grimy walls, scratched into the very stone by a man the world had also forgotten, was a secret that would unravel a town's darkest lie and rewrite its future forever. Settle in, and let us tell you a story of how the most dismissed places can hold the most powerful truths. We'd love to know where you're watching from tonight, as we journey back to a time of dust, dignity, and quiet rebellion. Emmeline Hale arrived in Redemption Flats on the back of a freight wagon, clinging to a small carpet bag that held everything she owned: a change of dress, her sister's locket, and $37. The wind was a constant, a physical presence that scoured the flat land and pushed against the small clapboard buildings as if trying to erase them. It had been a month since she'd buried Mary, a month since her brother-in-law, Silas, his face a mask of pinched grief and impatience, had told her she could no longer stay. "This is my house now," he'd said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a closing door. "A grown woman needs her own way." His way of saying her presence was a constant reminder of his loss, a burden he no longer wished to bear. She didn't argue. The fight had gone out of her by Mary's sickbed, watching her sister fade like a photograph left in the sun. She simply nodded, packed her bag, and walked away from the only home she'd known since her parents were taken by fever 5 years prior. Redemption Flats wasn't a destination. It was simply where the wagons stopped. It was a town of one dusty main street, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a new brick courthouse that stood proud and out of place against the weathered wood surrounding it. Hope was a scarce commodity here, same as water. People's faces were as weathered as the buildings, their eyes holding a kind of resigned suspicion for newcomers. Emmeline took a room at the boarding house, paying for a week in advance, and spent the first 2 days just walking. She walked the perimeter of the town, her worn boots kicking up pale dust, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She was trying to walk the tremor out of her hands, the hollowness out of her chest. She was a ghost in a town that had no memory of her, and the anonymity was both a comfort and a curse. On the third day, she saw the notice tacked to the board outside the general store. It was a county auction notice, handwritten in neat, looping script. The county was selling off surplus property. There was a list of small, barren parcels of land nobody wanted, and at the very bottom, one peculiar item: Old County Jailhouse and Lot, stone construction, sold as is, minimum bid $1. Emmeline read the line 3 times. The laughter and whispers of the men reading it beside her were a low hum. A jail, a place of misery and confinement. But to Emmeline, who felt she was living in a prison of grief already, the words looked different. Stone construction. It sounded permanent. It sounded solid. In a world that had proven to be made of sand and shifting loyalties, stone sounded like something a person could hold on to. The auction was held on the steps of the new courthouse the following Saturday. A small crowd had gathered, mostly out of boredom. Sheriff Barton, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest and whose face was perpetually flushed with self-importance, was acting as auctioneer. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, booming it across the dusty square. as he dispensed with the worthless land parcels for a few dollars apiece to ranchers looking to add to their grazing territory. Then he came to the last item. "All right, folks," he bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Last on the docket, the old county jail. A fine piece of local history," he said, drawing a ripple of laughter from the crowd. "Built solid, I'll give it that. But the county's got no use for it. And frankly, it's an eyesore. We'll start the bidding at $1. Do I hear $1 for that useless pile of rocks?" He grinned, expecting silence. He wanted to declare it unsold, to eventually have it torn down. $1, a quiet voice said. The voice was clear and steady, but so unexpected it cut through the murmuring. Every head turned. Emmeline Hale stood at the back of the crowd, her hand raised just enough to be seen. She wore her one good dress, faded but clean, and her expression was calm, her chin held high. Sheriff Barton's smirk faltered, replaced by disbelief, then open contempt. "The girl?" someone muttered. "What's she want with that place?" The sheriff stared at her. $1 from the young lady. Do I hear $2? He looked around, his eyes daring anyone to bid against this foolish girl. The crowd was silent, their amusement turning to a kind of pitying curiosity. $1 going once, Barton called, his voice laced with mockery. Going twice. He paused, letting the humiliation hang in the air. Sold, he finally snapped, slamming a small gavel onto the lectern. To the girl with more dollars than cents, for $1. The crowd broke into whispers and a few outright laughs. Emmeline ignored them. She walked forward through the parting sea of bodies, her gaze fixed on the deed in the sheriff's hand. She placed her silver dollar on the lectern. It rang with a clear, final sound in the sudden quiet. What could a lone woman possibly do with a derelict jailhouse on the edge of the Texas Panhandle? What secrets did those sun-bleached stones hold, and why had the town been so quick to forget the men who had lived and died within them? The answers would come not with a shout, but with the patient scrape of a brush against stone, revealing a truth more dangerous than anyone in Redemption Flats could ever imagine. Let us know in the comments what you think Emmeline should do first, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of forgotten history. Now, as the deed was placed in her hand, her ownership was official, but her trials were only just beginning. The walk to the general store was a gauntlet of stairs. Emmeline felt them on her back, on the side of her face, a mixture of pity, scorn, and sheer bewilderment. The purchase of the jailhouse had made her the town's newest and most baffling spectacle. Inside the store, the talk ceased the moment she pushed the door open, the little bell above it announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, simply looked at her over the rims. "Help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes full of questions. Emmeline needed supplies: a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, a bar of lye soap, a sack of flour, and some coffee. The barest essentials for survival and for the monumental task that lay ahead. As Mr. Henderson weighed out the flour, the whispers started again in the corner where a few ranchers were gathered. "Pile of rocks? Haunted, I hear. Old man Rook died in there. Coughed his last rite in that north cell." Emmeline kept her face forward, pretending not to hear, the names and warnings just more wind blowing past. As she stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, her arms laden with her purchases, Sheriff Barton blocked her path. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his shadow falling over her completely. "Well now, Miss Hale," he said, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "Got your housekeeping supplies, I see. Planning on scrubbing the sin out of those walls?" His deputies, standing behind him, snickered. Emmeline met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any retort could have. "Let me give you some free advice," he continued, leaning closer, his voice dropping. That place ain't fit for a dog, let alone a lady. It's a tomb. You'd be wise to sell the lot for scrapstone and get on the next wagon out of town. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel small and foolish. He was succeeding in making her feel small, but a stubborn, quiet anger began to kindle in the cold place her grief had occupied. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "It's my property now, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but firm. Barton's eyes narrowed. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills on a dusty street, before he finally straightened up with a dismissive snort. "Have it your way," he scoffed. "Enjoy your tombstone, girl." He and his men moved past her, their laughter trailing behind them. Shaken but resolute, Emmeline continued down the street. As she passed the alleyway beside the livery, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in 2 long, gray braids. She was Comanche, Emmeline guessed from her high cheekbones and the intricate beadwork on her deerskin vest. The townspeople gave her a wide berth, a mixture of fear and respect in their avoidance. The woman's dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on Emmeline. She looked at the bucket and brush in Emmeline's arms, then at her face. The woman took a step closer, her gaze so intense it felt as if she were seeing right through to the bone. She raised a leathery hand and pointed a single, steady finger toward the edge of town, in the direction of the old jail. "Some walls don't hold men in," the woman said, her voice raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "They hold truth still." And with that, she turned and disappeared back into the alley as silently as she had appeared. Emmeline stood frozen, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. She didn't understand them, not then. They were just another strange current in a day full of them. But she would remember them. She would carry them with her, another small, hard possession, as she walked the final 100 yards to her new home. The jailhouse sat squat and defiant at the very edge of Redemption Flats, where the town gave way to the endless, waving grass of the prairie. It was set back from the main road, a solitary block of sun-bleached limestone that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The roof was slate and mostly intact, but the wooden door hung slack on a single rusted hinge, permanently ajar like a mouth agape. The 2 windows, little more than slits in the stone, were barred with iron so corroded it looked like skeletal fingers. There was no glass. The wind whistled through them, a low, mournful sound. Emmeline set her supplies down in the dust and simply looked. From a distance it had seemed solid. Up close, it was a study in decay. Weeds grew thick and tenacious from cracks in the foundation. The air around it was heavy with the smell of neglect, of dust and damp and rat leavings, and something deeper, a cold, mineral scent of old sorrow. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The sheriff's word echoed in her mind. Tombstone. It did look like one. A faint scratching sound from behind the building drew her attention. She walked around the side, her boots crunching on loose gravel. There, huddled against the relative warmth of the stone wall, was a dog. It was a scruff of a thing, ribs showing through a coat of indeterminate color, matted with burrs and dust. One ear was torn. It watched her with weary, intelligent eyes, too weak or too defeated to run. It didn't growl, just gave a faint thump of its tail against the dirt. Emmeline felt a pang of recognition. Here was another creature cast out and forgotten, clinging to the shelter of a forsaken place. She broke off a piece of the small loaf of bread she'd bought and tossed it gently. The dog crept forward, snatched it, and retreated to its spot, wolfing it down in 2 bites. "You can stay," Emmeline murmured, as much to herself as to the animal. "If you've got nowhere else to be." The dog seemed to understand. It laid its head on its paws and watched her. She had found her first and only ally. That night, she didn't dare sleep inside. The interior was a black pit of unknown filth and darkness. Instead, she built a small fire a few yards from the entrance, using dried brush and a few splintered planks she found nearby. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket, her back against her meager sacks of supplies, and watched the stars emerge in the vast, ink-black sky. The dog, which she had decided to call Ghost for his pale, dusty color and silent presence, crept closer to the fire and lay down, letting out a long, contented sigh. The jailhouse loomed beside them, a dark shape against the starfield. It didn't feel menacing. It felt watchful, patient. It had been waiting a long time. Emmeline listened to the wind moving through the barred windows, a constant, low song. It sounded like a voice trying to speak, a story trying to be told. She closed her eyes, the locket with her sister's likeness clutched in her hand, and for the first time since Mary's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. She had Stone at her back and a fellow Stray by her side. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a beginning. The work would start at dawn. The next morning, Emmeline began. With her new bucket, she made a dozen trips to the town well, hauling water back to the jailhouse. Ghost trotted faithfully at her heels, a silent, four-legged shadow. The interior of the jail was worse than she had imagined. It was comprised of 2 small cells on either side of a narrow corridor, and a small front office area. Everything was coated in a thick, greasy layer of grime, cobwebs as thick as cotton batting hanging from the corners. The air was stagnant and foul, but the stone floors and walls were solid, the ironwork of the cell doors immovable. It was built to last. She started with the office, sweeping out years of accumulated dirt and debris, chasing out a family of mice. Then, she turned her attention to the cells. She chose the one on the north side, the one the men in the store had mentioned. She propped the heavy iron door open and braced herself. Taking a deep breath, she dipped her brush into the bucket of hot, soapy water and set it against the wall. The grime was stubborn, caked on by years of humidity and neglect. It took all of her strength to scrub, her arms and back quickly beginning to ache. The water in the bucket turned black almost instantly. She worked in a slow, methodical rhythm. Scrub, rinse, repeat. The stone beneath the filth was a pale, cool gray. For hours, she worked her way along one wall, moving from the floor upwards. It was mindless, exhausting labor. But there was a strange peace in it. She wasn't thinking about Silas or Mary or her own uncertain future. She was focused only on the small patch of wall in front of her, on the simple, honest act of making something clean. As the afternoon sun slanted through the narrow window, casting a single beam of light across her work, she stopped to rest. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a raw hand, she leaned against the opposite wall. Her eyes traced the newly cleaned section of stone, and that's when she saw them. Faint lines, scratches. At first, she dismissed them as random marks, graffiti left by some long-gone prisoner. But as she looked closer, she saw they weren't random at all. There was a precision to them, a deliberation. A series of short, vertical lines, crossed by a diagonal one like a tally, then another set, and another. Below them, a date, crudely but clearly carved, 1878. Her fingers traced the cool stone. This was more than a mark. This was a record. She moved the lantern closer, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. Beneath the date, almost invisible against the gray stone, was a name. 5 letters, carefully etched with something sharp. J. Rook, the name from the store. The man who had died in this very cell. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cool air. She was not alone in this cell. The ghost of Jay Rook was here, and he had left something behind. The discovery of the name spurred her on. The labor was no longer just about cleaning, it was about uncovering. For the next week, Emmeline worked with a feverish intensity. Every morning she rose with the sun, hauled her water, and began to scrub. Ghost would lie in the doorway, a watchful guardian, his head cocked as if listening to the secrets the stones were giving up. The work was brutal. Her hands were blistered and raw, her muscles screaming in protest. But with every square foot of wall she cleaned, more of the strange markings emerged. They weren't just in the north cell. The south cell held them too. It was a language of scratches, a tapestry of desperation and patience. She realized the tally marks were days, weeks, months, a calendar of confinement. But there was more. Interspersed with the dates were other symbols. Crude drawings of what looked like cattle brands. A lazy S, a double diamond, a circle T, brands she didn't recognize from the local ranches. There were also strings of numbers, sometimes arranged in pairs, that made no sense to her. And then there were the words, short phrases scratched with painstaking effort. Miller Herd, South Fork, Night. Another section read, Widow Hemlock, Deed Forged. At night, by the flickering light of her single lantern, Emmeline began the second part of her work. She used the few precious sheets of paper she owned and a piece of charcoal from the fire to meticulously transcribe the carvings from the walls. She drew the brands exactly as they appeared. She wrote down the numbers and the cryptic phrases. The walls of her small living space, the former jail office, became covered in these strange notes. It was a puzzle, and she felt a growing, urgent need to solve it. Jay Rook, whoever he was, had not been idle in his final days. He had been leaving a message, a testament. He had used the only paper he had, the very walls of his prison. This place wasn't a tomb, it was a book. During the day, she would sometimes feel a profound connection to the man. As her hands scraped away the grime, she imagined his hands carving the stone, the slow, patient work of a man with nothing left but time and a story to tell. She felt his anger, his meticulous care, his desperation to not be forgotten, to not let the truth die with him. Her frequent trips to the town well, her buckets now for cleaning instead of just for survival, did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Barton would often watch her from his office across the street, his expression a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. Her persistence bothered him. She was supposed to have given up, to have fled the town in defeat. Instead, she was working on that forgotten building with a purpose he could not fathom. One afternoon, he confronted her as she drew water. "Still playing house in that mausoleum, Miss Hale?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You're starting to look as haunted as the place itself." Emmeline simply looked at him, her face smudged with dirt, her hands wrapped in rags to protect her blisters. "Just cleaning, Sheriff," she replied, her voice even. It was left in a sorry state. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for something, some sign of what she was up to. "Some things are best left buried in the dirt," he said, his voice low and hard. It was a clear warning. But it was too late. Emmeline had already begun to dig. She knew she was onto something, something important, something dangerous. The brands, the names, the numbers, they were pieces of a story someone, very likely the sheriff himself, did not want told. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon 2 weeks into her labor. While scrubbing the lowest part of the wall in the south cell, near the floor, her brush dislodged a loose stone. Behind it, tucked into a small, hand-carved cavity, was a small object wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. It was the tattered, coverless remnant of a small Bible, its pages yellowed and fragile. Tucked inside was a single, folded piece of paper. On it was a key. A simple substitution cipher. A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. But it was more complex than that. It was tied to the Bible. A set of numbers like 3:16 meant the third book, 16th verse. A letter could be represented by the first letter of a certain word in a certain verse. It was ingenious, a code that would mean nothing to anyone without this key and the book it belonged to. J. Rook had made sure his message could only be read by someone who found his hidden tools. That night, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly hold the charcoal, Emmeline began to translate. She started with a long string of numbers she had transcribed from the wall above where Rook had died. Using the key, she cross-referenced the pages of the tattered Bible. The numbers resolved into letters, the letters into words. The first message was clear and chilling. Barton Sheriff, he is the wolf. A cold dread washed over her. This was not just a record of a prisoner's despair. It was an accusation. She worked through the night, the lantern burning low, Ghost whining softly at her feet as if sensing her distress. One by one, the secrets of the walls gave themselves up to her. The cattle brands she had copied were next to dates. The cipher turned the accompanying numbers into names of ranches. Barton took Miller Herd, drove them south to sell, blamed rustlers. The numbers that looked like coordinates were tied to a name she had seen, Widow Hemlock. The translated text read, "Deed for Widow Hemlock's quarter section, forged by Barton after he ran her off." Emmeline felt sick. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic campaign of fraud and violence by the town's highest lawmen. The final, most damning message was carved directly over the spot where a prisoner would lay his head to sleep. It was the longest and the last. She translated it with a growing sense of horror, the words appearing on her paper like a ghost's confession. Barton shot Hemlock's boy when he came asking questions. Said it was me. He planted the gun. He lies. He is a murderer. God see this truth. J. Rook. Just like that, the puzzle was complete. J. Rook wasn't a killer. He was a witness. He had been arrested and silenced, left to die in this cell with the truth burning inside him. He had spent his last days, his last ounces of strength, turning his prison into a permanent, undeniable record of Sheriff Barton's crimes. Emmeline sat back on her heels. The transcribed pages spread before her on the stone floor. The wind moaned through the bars. It no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like a cry for justice. And she, a girl with nothing, was the only one who had heard it. The knowledge was a heavy, dangerous weight. Emmeline knew she couldn't just walk into the courthouse and accuse the sheriff. Barton owned this town. He would destroy her, and he would destroy the evidence. She needed more. She needed proof that would corroborate the story on the walls. For the next few days, she walked into town with a new purpose. She told Mr. Henderson at the store that she was looking for any old newspapers he might have to use for insulation. He was happy to be rid of a dusty stack from the back room. She spent 2 nights poring over the yellowed pages from 1878, the year of Rook's arrest. She found it. A small article detailing the arrest of Jasper Rook, a drifter, for the murder of Thomas Hemlock. The article, quoting Sheriff Barton extensively, painted Rook as a violent vagrant. It mentioned the stolen cattle, the land disputes, all pinned on this one convenient scapegoat. The official story matched the lies Rook had described. Her next step was riskier. She went to the new courthouse, to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a man named Abernathy, was elderly and meticulous, with ink-stained fingers and a quiet, professional demeanor. Emmeline told him she was interested in the history of her new property and wanted to see the old deed records for the surrounding area. It was a plausible enough request. For 2 days, she sat in a dusty corner of the records room, poring over the heavy ledgers. And she found it all. The original deed for the Hemlock property, signed and sealed, and then, a year later, a new deed, transferring the property to a holding company. The signature on the transfer was a clumsy forgery of Mrs. Hemlock's name, and the notary stamp was from a man who, according to the newspapers, had left town a month before the document was dated. The holding company's owner? A man from a neighboring county, a known business associate of Sheriff Barton. She also found records of cattle sales from that same period. Large, unbranded herds sold for cash by that same associate. The pieces were all there, a trail of paper and ink that confirmed every scratch Jay Rook had carved into the stone. Her quiet research, however, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Barton had seen her leaving the courthouse. Her presence was no longer a foolish curiosity. It was a threat. As Emmeline walked back to the jailhouse late one afternoon, the sky to the north had turned a bruised, ugly purple. A storm was coming, a real Texas norther. The wind picked up, whipping dust into her eyes. Just as she reached her door, she saw him. Sheriff Barton, riding out from town, his face dark as the storm clouds. He was coming for her. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and sharp. Just as he drew near, she heard another sound, the frantic shouts of a man and the terrified cries of a child. A wagon, its rear wheel splintered and broken, was stranded on the road not 50 yards away. A man, a woman, and a small girl were huddled against the raging wind. Barton ignored them, his eyes fixed on Emmeline. But she couldn't. "Get inside!" she screamed at the family over the howl of the wind. "Hurry!" She threw open the heavy wooden door to the jailhouse and helped the mother and child inside, while the father hobbled after them, his ankle clearly injured. She slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into place just as the first drops of rain, cold as ice, began to fall. Through the barred window, she saw Barton rein in his horse, staring at the closed door, his face contorted in fury as the full force of the storm hit. He was forced to turn his horse and ride back, defeated by the gale. Emmeline leaned against the door, her heart pounding. She had used the jail not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. She had barred the door against the lawman to protect the innocent. In that moment, her choice was made. She would not run. She would see this through. The storm raged all night, a terrifying symphony of wind and rain. Inside the old jailhouse, the stone walls held firm, a bulwark against the chaos. Emmeline shared her meager supplies with the stranded family, the Clarks. The father, John, was a land surveyor from Amarillo. His wife, Sarah, cared for their daughter, Lily, who was mesmerized by Ghost, the dog, who seemed to sense the need for calm and lay quietly beside her. By the light of the lantern, surrounded by the transcribed secrets on the walls, Emmeline found the courage to tell them everything. She showed John Clark her notes, the brands, the coordinates, the story of Jasper Rook. John, a man accustomed to the precision of maps and ledgers, listened intently. He looked over her transcriptions, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These coordinates," he said, pointing to the numbers associated with the Hemlock property. "They're not just for the quarter section. They map out the spring-fed creek that waters the whole valley. Whoever controls that land controls the water for 50 miles. He looked at her, his expression grim. "This isn't just theft. This is a man trying to build an empire." When dawn broke, the world outside was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving a calm, cool quiet in its wake. John Clark, his ankle tightly bound, looked at Emmeline with a newfound respect. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice sincere, "what you have done here, it is more than just uncovering a crime. You have given a voice back to a dead man." The family's gratitude was a balm to her spirit. They were the first people to look at her, not with pity or scorn, but with admiration. As they prepared to limp back toward town to get their wagon repaired, John made a promise. "I will stand with you," he said. The surveyor's office in Amarillo has copies of the original plat maps. Barton can't have forged them all. I will be your witness. He was the first pebble in what was about to become an avalanche. News of the family sheltered in the old jail spread through town faster than fire in dry grass. When Emmeline walked toward the courthouse later that morning, with John Clark hobbling beside her, something had changed. The whispers that followed her were no longer mocking. They were curious, uncertain. A few townsfolk, emboldened by the presence of an outsider, began to follow them. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. She didn't go to the sheriff's office. She went straight to the circuit judge, a stern, fair-minded man named Richter who was in town for the week. She found him in his chambers, with Mr. Abernathy, the county clerk, at his side. Sheriff Barton was there, too, already trying to poison the well, claiming Emmeline was a troubled, hysterical girl. But Judge Richter held up a hand for silence. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice even, "I am told you have something to present to this court." With a calm she did not feel, Emmeline laid her papers on his desk. The transcriptions from the wall, her notes from the old newspapers, the discrepancies she'd found in the deed ledger. She told the story of Jasper Rook, her voice clear and steady in the silent room. When she finished, Barton burst into laughter, loud and false. "This is absurd. The ravings of a dead murderer and a lonely girl. There's no proof." "There is," Mr. Abernathy, the quiet clerk, said, stepping forward. He had been listening, his face pale. "I always had my doubts about that Hemlock transfer. The notary's seal. It wasn't right." He pulled out the original ledger and opened it for the judge. At the same time, John Clark stepped forward, presenting his own professional assessment of the land grab and the forged survey lines. The judge looked from the ledger to Emmeline's notes, then to the sweating sheriff. "The walls, you say?" Judge Richter asked Emmeline. "The proof is on the walls?" "Yes, sir," she replied. "Every word." The judge stood. "Then we shall go and read them." The procession that walked to the old jailhouse was half the town. Judge Richter, Emmeline, the Clarks, Mr. Abernathy, and a humbled Sheriff Barton, with the townspeople trailing behind. They entered the clean, sunlit cells, and there, on the stone, faint but undeniable, was the truth. The brands, the dates, the names. J. Rook's meticulous, desperate testament, clear as day. The crowd was silent, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning anger. They were seeing their town's history, its deepest wound, laid bare. Sheriff Barton, standing in the cell where Rook had died, seemed to shrink. The bluster and arrogance were gone, replaced by the flat, empty look of a man who had been caught by a ghost. There was no need for a confession. The stones themselves were the accusers. Months passed. The autumn sun cast a long, golden light over Redemption Flats. The town felt different, lighter. Sheriff Barton was gone, removed by a U.S. Marshal and awaiting trial in a federal court. A new, younger sheriff was in his place, a man who spoke quietly and treated people with fairness. The story of Emmeline Hale and the jailhouse had become local legend. People called it the Library of Truth. Emmeline had stayed. The old jail was her home now. She had put glass in the windows and planted a small garden of hardy vegetables and wildflowers out front. The door was never barred. Ghost, no longer a scrawny stray but a healthy, loyal companion, lay on the stone step, basking in the afternoon warmth. The townspeople no longer shunned her. They brought her things, a fresh-baked pie, a spare blanket, seeds for her garden. They would stop and talk, not about the past, but about the weather, the price of cattle, the future. They had looked into the darkness of their own town, and thanks to her, had found their way out. She had scrubbed away more than just grime. She had scrubbed away a long-held fear. One evening, as she sat on the step watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and rose, the new sheriff rode by. He stopped his horse and tipped his hat to her. "Evening, Miss Hale," he said. "Just wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For reminding us," he said simply, "that the law is supposed to serve the truth, not the other way around." He nodded once more and rode on. Emmeline watched him go, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She looked at the sturdy stone building behind her. It had been her sanctuary, her project, her purpose. It had saved her, just as she had saved the truth within it. Mr. Clark had offered to buy the property from her for a handsome sum, knowing the value of the land and its water rights. She had politely refused. A young boy from town, sent to deliver some fresh milk, looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Is it true what my pa says?" he asked, "that this used to be a jail?" Emmeline smiled, a real, gentle smile. She reached down and ran a hand over the cool, familiar stone of the wall, where a man's final words had waited so patiently. "It's not a jail," she said softly, answering a question she hadn't known she was asking herself all this time. "It's a library of truth." Thank you for staying with us to the very end of Emmeline's journey. Her story is a powerful reminder of the power of listening to the forgotten, and how one person's courage can bring light to the darkest of places. If you were moved by her quiet determination, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a story of justice hard-won. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of history's hidden heroes. We'll see you next time.